This conversation is going to be between Sarah Douglas, editor-in-chief of ARTnews, who is a leading arts journalist and editor in her field with more than 20 years of experience. Today, she speaks with Maria Lanko, co-founder of the NAKEDROOM in Kiev and co-curator of the Ukrainian Pavilion this year at the 59th Venice Biennale, taking place in just a few weeks' time. Here, Maria will reflect on her experiences since the outbreak of the war in the Ukraine, including her responsibility in representing the Ukraine with artist Pavlo Makov in Venice. I would like to draw your attention to, there's a little card in your tote bag that has a QR code on it. And you can help by donating to this link on the QR code, which takes you to the Ukrainian Emergency Art Fund. And this art fund is dedicated to supporting independent artists, curators, and cultural works of Ukraine who have a right to live, be safe, and continue their work. So please do donate if you can. If you can't find the card, the URL is ueaf.moca.org.ua. So please do visit that if you want to give and learn more. So thank you so much, Sarah and Maria, for being here, and I will turn it over to Sarah to begin.
Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me? Is this on? Okay, good. So if you were here, which I assume most of you were for the last panel, I feel they could not have actually set us up better by saying, why are you here? And I had this thought about Maria. I was thinking, well, because she's not here. Or in other words, she made it out of a war-ravaged country, and not only made it out, but brought an artwork with her, which is pretty impressive. And I also just jotted down as I was sitting in the audience, the idea of, why are you here? And I sort of said, well, to prove that art goes on in times like these, I think she's here as proof of that fact, and to sort of throw the best of what humans are capable in the face of the worst. And I think that what I want to sort of focus on is, I think the centerpiece of what we're talking about is actually a journey that Maria is still on, technically, of enabling the Ukrainian Pavilion in Venice to happen. And I just want to take you back just a few weeks ago, which is crazy to think, that there were news reports that it was unclear what was happening with the pavilion. I believe the curators were in Kiev, the artist was in Kyiv, if I'm correct. And then just a couple weeks later, there were articles saying, well, actually what happened was Maria left Kiev with the artwork in her car, literally the day after the invasion of Ukraine, so February 25th, I believe it was.
24th, actually, in the night.
24th,
yeah.
Okay.
The same day.
It was the same day, okay, which is incredible. And I thought that we could start out, because I think she can just give you a little bit of context about herself, her fellow curators, about the NAKEDROOM, and then she is going to take you through her journey with some images. So I want to first ask you about the NAKEDROOM and its context within the Ukrainian art scene.
Thank you, Sarah, for this introduction. First of all, I have to say that we are from Ukraine. And by saying we, despite myself being here alone on the stage, today I'm speaking with my community, with my both teams from the NAKEDROOM Gallery and from the Ukrainian Pavilion in Venice, and most of all from the community of artists, curators, and other practitioners, most of whom are staying in Ukraine, resisting the invasion and at times of an occupation. So going back in time, it's really hard to go back to this time. But I have to introduce my context. I'm curator, I'm co-owner of the NAKEDROOM Gallery in Kiev, which we co-founded together with my lifetime professional partner, Lehrman, 3.5 years ago. And it's a very young, as you can see, and a very kind of small space. The whole gallery, the whole space is just around 100 square meters, which I looked it up. It's around 1,000 square feet, and only half of it is an actual exhibition space. We also have a small bar, a bookshop, and our office with a storage in there. But despite being so young and pretty small, we were, from the very beginning, very ambitious in working with up-and-coming Ukrainian artists. And here, by up-and-coming, I don't mean the level of maturity or even age, but I mean their position on the art scene, both nationally and internationally. And we wanted to make a proper representation of their work within the country and in a global scale. And we quite succeeded with that. We also created a market for their work because before that, most of Ukrainian collectors were very much focused on the established names, on the big names, and weren't really paying attention on the younger artists. But in addition to that, we also work with some prominent names of Ukrainian art, some established artists like Pavlo Makov, but also with several artist estates and family collections that we conserve, preserve, and study. And with that kind of work, it's important for us to establish a continuity in art practices of Ukrainian artists and to look for connections with the recent history, with the artworks that were created in the late 80s, early 90s, and to find relevance for them in the present day. And the artist Pavlo Makov is one of those, big figures for Ukrainian art. We'll talk a little bit about him later today. And the artwork that we chose to present at Venice Biennale, to participate in the national competition actually, a couple of years ago, was his old piece conceived in the early 90s. And it was a piece, I will talk about it in detail later, that was never fully realized. It was only partially realized. So for us, at Venice Biennale, there was a challenge to present the work working, like functioning properly for the first time in history. And it is a fountain, basically, and it consists of two principal parts. One of them is a more artistic one. It's kind of a pattern of bronze funnels that are being assembled in a triangular form. And the second part of the fountain is basically the backdrop, the technical thing, the wall holding those funnels with a pump inside and a basin where the water would be stored.
And just for context, it was originally conceived, I think, in 1995, is that right?
Yeah, 1994, 1995. This is us, our small team, actually presenting the Ukrainian Pavilion for the Ukrainian public and journalists at the NAKEDROOM gallery on January 17th this year. It was one of the last big events we could hold. And I have to say that, February 24th, of course, took us by a huge shock, but it didn't also take us by a huge surprise. We were, most of us were aware that, the escalation is going to happen in the next several weeks. And we were, in a way, preparing ourselves for that as much as you can prepare yourself for that. We were speeding up our production team. We were speeding up the producers, basically, of the fountain, of both the funnels and the backdrop construction. And actually, our contract with the funnels, it said that the 24th was the delivery day of the funnels. But they succeeded to do it 2 weeks earlier. And when I had those 3 boxes of those pieces that look like this, I understood that if whatever happens, I have them in my hands, they fit in my car, just in my trunk, and half of the, I can just, take them to Venice, and in any way we will be present, even with a symbolical presence. Of course, there wouldn't be a fully functional fountain, but at least there will be a part of the work which is the core of it. And yeah, on the February 24th, this is in a way the end of history in Ukraine, or better to say the end of history. And we started a new calendar that day. Now we only count the days of the war, because February 24th was the last date I could remember. Actually, I can still remember on this date. We all woke up to explosions in our cities of Kiev and Kharkiv. Well, our team is based between those two cities. And we started, of course, calling each other, trying to, and also calling our families, friends, trying to figure out what we could do in the next couple of hours. And the situation was escalating pretty fast. There's people who couldn't, leave immediately, like in the first couple of hours, like 5 a.m., 6 a.m. Then it was almost impossible to go out of town. It was jammed, and the Russian army was approaching very fast, and the shelling was already around the city. But closer to the evening, it seemed that the only road that still remained untouched, that it's still open, and it's still possible to leave the city with the car on that. And originally, it was my responsibility to take the artwork, because
I was going to ask, had this all been discussed beforehand?
Beforehand, I don't have children, and that was also my first thought when I woke up. How lucky I am to have no children and no dependent people on myself. So I was pretty, I had to take care only about myself and my art. And that's why I also had a car with full tank. I was kind of prepared for that too. And my co-curator and my partner, Lisa, she was 39 weeks pregnant at the time. And she made the decision to stay at home because her parents were there and they were able, she wanted to give birth to her child in a couple of days in Kiev, despite, the situation going on. And my third co-curator, Boris, we can see him here. He was then in the west of Ukraine together with his girlfriend, though his family was staying in Kharkiv, and the image you can see on the right is actually just outside the house where Pavlo Makov, our artist, lives. And this is an image that he sent me, on the second day when I was already on the road with a missile, just...
And so this image on the right is in Kharkiv?
It is in Kharkiv, yes. This is a couple of photographs on day 3 from Lisa, from pregnant Lisa and her husband, who tried to barricade. They couldn't leave, for bomb shelter very often because her husband had a broken leg and she was, with her belly, and it's not very, they weren't very quick in going up and down. So they decided it's better, to cover all the windows. However, I think it's more of a psychological cover than a real one. If the shelling comes into your house, then the carpets, of this kind, they don't really help to save your life. And that's myself on day 4 with a car with a broken window. It's not related to war, but it's just happened on the way, and it was impossible to fix it. And this is my first more or less comfortable night on the way. I reached Pavshino. It's a small village in the very west of Ukraine, and I had to say that the road was very, very complicated. It was more or less jammed all the time, and the accommodation was impossible to find. So many people, if they had to stay overnight, they either slept in their cars or, in some gyms organized for people on the move. I was sleeping in very, very cold houses of random people, and this was the first night when I reached Pavshino, and a good friend of mine, an artist I work with, Stas Turina, his grandfather lived in Pavshino, and this was a house that belonged to him. He recently passed away, and this was a house I heard about so many times from Stas, from the artist who worked there as well. This was a kind of, a place that you feel that it's your guardian angel, when you come there. And for me, it was like that. I spent there 3 days before actually crossing the border. Day 4 is another event I wanted to mention. The time the biggest airplane that Ukraine owned, the biggest airplane in the world, called Mriya, it's the dream in Ukrainian, it was destroyed in Hostomel airport. And when Mriya is important here, as you can see, one of the images is Mriya flying over Venice. It's a collage, obviously, but it's actually a project for the previous Ukrainian Pavilion at Venice Biennale. I will speak about it later. And the third image, it's a real Mriya flying over the NAKEDROOM gallery in Kiev half a year ago when they were practicing for a military parade for the Independence Day. This is our artist, and as an artist, he was perhaps one of, despite being in Kharkiv, which was in a much worse condition, position from the very beginning. It was heavily shelled from day one. But he, as an artist, had a kind of privilege to stay in the most luxurious bomb shelter ever. And that bomb shelter was in Yermila Center, an art gallery in Kharkiv, which is located in an actual bomb shell of Kharkiv University. Yeah, but it's a huge, warm space. You can even see art on the walls. They didn't put down the exhibition, and he felt pretty comfortable. Also, given lots of interviews to international media from that bomb shelter for all those days. He wouldn't move because he had his 92-year-old mother in Kharkiv who he couldn't leave behind, but she would refuse to leave. She was saying something like, I've survived one war already, you can't take me down even to a bomb shelter, not speaking out of Kharkiv. Yeah, but it started to change, when this is the Kharkiv's regional administration just across the square from the Kharkiv University where Pavel was staying. And when the missile hit that administration, Pavel said that it felt like it actually hit his head despite him being in a bombshell. And the same happened more or less to his mother's house. There was a missile in the yard next to her house, and at that moment she was in a way awakened, and she called Pavel and said, "Okay, I'm ready to go." And that was on day 7. That was near her house, and the second image is of myself at the border. Well, not myself, but the signs at the border I was crossing. So it took me a week to get to the border, and then another, I think, 14 days of a trip across Europe. And some images from, evacuation means used by people, from Kharkiv and other affected places, and also a reflection of the artist. Here already you can see, in this people lying in the carriage. I'm not showing you, the images of mass gravings, but you already see how dehumanized, people look, in this position, and this is only the start of what's going on. And this is on the right hand, this is Stas Turina, the artist in whose house I was staying, and his partner, Katya Lipkind. They're important because that day, part of a huge psychiatric ward from the Kiev region had to be evacuated into the Kyiv Central Psychiatric Hospital, the biggest in the country and the most prominent. And those are two people who have good experience of working with neurodivergent people, because they also co-founded, together with us 3 years ago, a studio which is called Atelier Normalna. It's a studio normal, a normal studio for artists with and without Down syndrome, them working together. And it originally started where artists without Down syndrome were kind of tutors, but throughout 3 years of work, it was very clear that they weren't actually the tutors, that it was a very mutual process of creation and exchange. And this studio, in our view, like as curators, was one of the most interesting phenomena in Ukraine in the past several years. On day 14, we were supposed to open up an exhibition of the artist Zhenya Golubentsev. He's standing on that image in the middle wearing the greenish sweater, and he was the winner of the art prize that we founded last year together with the company Mont Blanc, perhaps their pens, and accessories. And the prize was called Artist Prize, and it was awarded by the artist to the artists. And Zhenya was the first winner of it, and as a part of the prize, he was supposed to have an exhibition at the NAKEDROOM, and his main subject is a cemetery, and so it was supposed to be an exhibition about the cemetery as a place that kind of from which he could grow any other topics. At the time, it was 9 days that Zhenya was missing together with his mother, because their house is located in the north of Kiev region, behind Gostomel, Irpin, and Bucha, if you heard those toponyms in the recent news. Date 19, I've reached Milan, and this is, I'm sitting together with producers of Technolenio company, the company that agreed to produce the remaining part of the fountain in order to make it as it was supposed to be in the pavilion. And yeah, they're holding one of the funnels that I brought to them. And day 21, I'm already in Venice, and the funnel reached its destination. Day 22 is the happiest day of this war. My co-curator Lisa gave birth to her little son, Lehrman. And yeah, and she was at the time the most happiest person, I think, in Ukraine, at least in my community, and supported me with that happiness a lot. Day 23, Pavlo Markov finally reached Venice too, and we met each other. He accommodated his mother safely in Vienna, and we're happy, as you see, to see each other. And this is my team member from Kiev, Pavlo, who didn't want to leave Kiev in the first weeks, but he had to because of his wife. You know, she was struggling with the situation, and he took her out. And this was the day when he decided that he's going back, and he came back, you know, and had this beautiful micro lunch, you know, from our bar supplies with the naked walls of the NAKEDROOM, and sent me this photograph. This is again Lisa, the happy mother, gave an interview basically from mostly from a bomb shelter. She was then in Lviv in a safer place, but and this is a CNN team that are making actually a movie about Ukrainian Pavilion. This I think is the strongest, you know, image of resistance that Ukraine is producing at the moment. On the left, you can see it's Kharkiv, the monument to Taras Shevchenko, one of the highest, you know, monuments in Ukraine. And from the first days of war, in different cities which were not under heavy attacks, people started covering the public monuments with sacks filled with sand. But mostly, you know, those monuments are, well, they're kind of reasonable size. And this Shevchenko is just so huge that it took them, I think, 10 days to cover it up. And of course, on the right side, this is already kind of an artistic reflection of that practice, the Rodina Mать, the biggest monument in Ukraine, which is impossible to cover, of course. Day 35, they were the first public testimonies of rapes of Ukrainian women by the Russian soldiers. And there's, I think, well, I can't say the beautiful, but very strong work by Katerina Lisavenko. She's one of the few artists who still is able to produce work under these circumstances, and she made, you know, 5 identical watercolors that kind of the same number as the woman given this interview experienced the rape. That is me flying to New York on day 36. And this is perhaps the heaviest day of the war so far, day 37, when the images from Bucha and Irpin were first published, and my Instagram yesterday looked like that. And still looks like it. You know, every image is more or less blocked by the Instagram. People started reposting it, but it's still concealed. Yeah, and here we are here, day 39, and I was finalizing the slides yesterday, and you know, I wrote this: Zhenya Golubentsev is still missing. But today I woke up again to the brightest news that they found him alive with his mother in his house in Vabля. So yeah, on the bright side, finishing the story here. I'm sorry if it was too long, but...
No, I mean, I think it was exactly...
Just to fill you in of the journey, which is not just my own.
Yes, exactly. I'm sure it was just a fraction of what actually went on. It's hard to know actually what to ask you first. I guess I wanted to... So I assume the Biennale, the pavilion at the Biennale will take place. Are you able to install the piece? How will it manifest itself? Are you able to install it and it can be a working fountain as it was intended? And I just wanted to, you know, you to give the audience a little more context for the piece itself.
So this is the architectural design from our team. Architectural team Forma that they made in Kiev, and we had our technical plans also ready and in place because we already produced it back in Kiev. And on my way to Italy, I started getting a lot of support from various institutions and individuals suggesting that they could help in production, in helping with the resources. And the company I mentioned, Technolenio, they agreed that they could produce it according to our plans, and that's what they're doing at the moment, and it should be ready by the beginning of next week, and we should install it by the end of the following week. So it has to be as it was planned. So you can see here it's the plan for the fountain, and it was originally conceived, as I said, in the early 90s in Kharkiv. And then Pavlo Makov is an artist. He predominantly works with graphics. He's a printmaker, basically, but also being a printmaker, he's not just producing, copies of the same kind of drawings that he makes in his boards, but for him printing is a creative process, so he creates huge kind of images combined of micro kind of drawings, details, and these become a kind of a visual kind of texts in a way, not even. But sometimes he also makes works not on paper, and Fountain is one of that. And in a way, his main subject is always the place, and his place for 30 years, for even more than 30 years, has been Kharkiv, the industrial city in the east of Ukraine, the first capital of Ukraine, as they like to say, but it was actually the capital of the Soviet Ukraine when the Bolsheviks could not still hold the western part of Ukraine. When they couldn't take Kyiv, they established kind of this capital in Kharkiv. And in the 1990s, this city, as many other post-Soviet cities, was deteriorating, and its infrastructure was collapsing more or less. And there were a couple of technogenic catastrophes, so to say. Well, once there was a huge flood, it flooded, the whole city. But at the same time, the water pipes broke down, and there was no running water in the city. So it was kind of a paradoxical situation. It was flooded, but there was no water for a couple of weeks, and people had to go out of the city, on their bikes to local villages in order to get some water. And looking at that, but also contemplating the kind of the emotion in the society back then, the lack of energy in a way. Pavlo came up with this idea of a paradoxical kind of image, or a paradoxical fountain, which is, despite being a fountain, is not in abundance. It doesn't produce. Right. It exhausts itself gradually because the water
gets to the bottom.
Absolutely, yes, and
it's a metaphor for society in a way.
It is. And when looking at it, 2 years ago when we were applying for the national competition for the pavilion, in conversation with Pavlo, we thought that it is now of global relevance. It was conceived from a very local situation, from his, being within that situation. But now we can think that, it can appeal to the world. And, with the war, it can appeal even more, I think.
Yeah, I was going to ask if he feels, that the piece takes on an additional resonance now, and if so, what is that resonance?
Well, obviously, because what also we think together, it came out of the recent discussions in this 3, 4, 5 weeks, that also this war is partly possible because of the exhaustion of the idea of democracy and the democratic institutes, and of the weakness of democratic world, and exhaustion of humanity in a way, and what we see now happening, to people in Ukraine who are completely dehumanized. What is it if not, exhaustion of these basics of human existence? So it obviously, we can't deny this context. That just, adds on. The work wasn't conceived, as a kind of manifest about the war. No, right. It wasn't. It was more of a. But I guess, artists have it. Sometimes they make things that, are ahead of certain processes in society and the world. So that's not surprising for me at all.
I'm curious if you have followed, you did show an image of, one artist who'd made an artwork in response to these reports of rape and so forth.
Yeah.
Have you, been following other artists who have been responding to sort of what they've been seeing, and what has stood out to you in terms of what artists are producing and how they're responding?
Well, not many artists can work at the moment, and we talked with Pablo, he can't even imagine starting to doing any work again,
Right.
It's like, it's exceptional, those who can do some things. And in my view, like Katya Lysavenko that I already mentioned, she's making one of the strongest, responses to, it's just one work, but she's making quite a lot. And I hope also we will be able to show her work sometime soon, somewhere in Europe for sure. But the foundation that was mentioned before, the Ukrainian Emergency Art Foundation, that are producing support, fundraising for support for Ukrainian artists and curators. They are also collecting the archive of the war, both visual and textual, like literally archive. So you can actually, if you follow their website, you can see some other artworks, there are plenty of them, but most of them are very, kind of straightforward in response to the war, mocking, Putin and Russian army and stuff like that. For a serious kind of reflection, you need safety, you need
Yes.
time, and
Yes.
you need energy, and this is something that we're lacking at the moment.
I'm curious, there has been, response throughout the art world to what's happening in Ukraine. There's been various galleries who have said, we will devote the proceeds from this booth at an art fair or, this sale of art. And I just wondered if, if any of them stand out to you as particularly meaningful or effective, and what you would say people could do to help, particularly the sort of cultural situation there, and help things to, at some point,
well, a lot of institutions have reached out, with suggesting, residences for Ukrainian artists, suggesting to work on Ukrainian-focused exhibitions, suggesting their help with evacuation of the works, well, from the border of Ukraine. Of course, nobody is going to cross the country's border then. So there is a lot of support, but I think this support should not only be immediate. Now I'm trying also to speak to several institutions that reached out to us and try to work on some more long-term programs, because even if this war ends tomorrow, the cultural sphere is devastated. It's simply, I can't imagine when I'll have the day when I'll be working normally back again, when we'll be able to sell art. This is something, from another planet. So, well, institutions need to change, I think, their perspective on who Ukrainian artists are and what they're doing, because they were often perceived as a part of, this post-Soviet kind of Russia-dominated cultural background.
Yeah, and on that note, maybe people in the audience don't know that the Ukraine Pavilion at Venice is actually of sort of relatively recent vintage, I guess you would say. The first Ukraine Pavilion was in 2001. And it's actually been one of these pavilions, if you're familiar with the format of the Biennale, that moves to different locations every year in the city, because it, unlike, say, the United States or Great Britain or France, there's no permanent pavilion.
Well, there was, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, there was one,
right.
Pavilion that was actually built with the money of Ukrainian philanthropist, right. Bogdan Khonenko, of whose museum and collection we have in Kiev. But, as a part of this big deal, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia inherited that pavilion
yes.
as theirs. So that's why, the new history of Ukrainian representations, yes, it starts in 2001. But before that, it was a part of the Soviet Union and was represented as a part of it in the Russian pavilion, which is... Yeah.
And you and I spoke, which of course will be empty.
Yes, obviously. The Biennale doesn't want anything in it.
Yes. And you and I were talking about this on the phone. I guess, you know, one of the, it's interesting to see the Biennale as a whole in light of what's happening right now, because so much of this conflict with, you know, the invasion on the part of Russia seems like from another time of a sort of nationalism and post-nationalism. And you look at the Venice Biennale, which came out of sort of late 19th century nationalism. And you know, you and I were talking about that and sort of saying, on the one hand, the Biennale seems like an outdated concept. You know, if we can say sort of all art is global now. On the other hand, it's fascinating because it represents these, in some ways, outdated sort of divisions and localities. And I wondered sort of what you've been thinking about in terms of that, just heading into this particular edition, which is so fraught.
Yeah, well, actually, despite it being so outdated, I love it somehow, because it's so blatantly political. You know, you don't have, you know, to navigate through the concealed kind of narratives that are of neutral institutions. You can see it as it is, yes. You know, because you can't, you know, take out that context of national representation. And for me, it's always interesting to see how countries perform themselves in an international kind of this global art world. What do they want to tell? You know, how they perform. And in this sense, you know, Ukrainian performance has always been pretty weak. And yeah, I have to be honest here, because our, you know, our public institutions, our governments have been pretty weak until recently, maybe. And,
on the other hand, you have Victor Pinchuk, who does a huge thing in Venice every time with his
absolutely, and they were taking over the National Pavilion a couple of times, yes, because right. Yeah, they were kind of the Ministry of Culture. They don't have the capacity to organize it, nor intellectual, neither financial. So, yeah, Victor Pinchuk was using, you know, this inability of the Ministry of Culture to produce anything in order to present his own projects. But you know, they were his. You know, that was the vision of Pinchuk Art Centre. It wasn't bad, but it was just not, you know, the National Pavilion.
Right. Obviously, this is something impossible to quantify. But I'm wondering, you know, when you look at what's happened, obviously the biggest loss is loss of life. But when you think about the cultural sphere, there's been loss of artworks, there's been, you know, destruction of buildings that house artworks. I wonder what stands out to you as the biggest losses, and how you think things could be reconstructed in some form. What can be saved?
I don't know. I think at the moment the biggest loss is the loss of ability to have a normal life again. I don't know how many, you know, years or months or I don't know have to come in order for us to heal in a way to be able to be creative again and like be funny and be emotional, you know, because we're now emotional, but on the other spectrum of the of the balance in a way. So this is a loss, you know, and loss is the disruption in our practices. You know, we've stopped doing things, and it's gonna last, obviously.
Well, I would like to open up to questions because we are running out of time, and I think there are so potentially many questions for Maria. If we have a mic right up here?
Hi, thank you so much for such an inspiring sharing your story. I don't know if I missed that part, but and it seems very trivial to speak about money when human, is at stake. But how do you fund yourself, knowing that the government doesn't attribute to culture and arts anymore, for now?
So the NAKEDROOM Gallery is actually the producer of the pavilion. You know, we've fundraised money for the pavilion, and we still have it on our accounts in a way, and we're spending it, but it might be the last money we spend in the next couple of months. So yeah, this is purely our investment as a gallery.
I actually I omitted to ask you for anyone who is going to the Venice Biennale, where is the pavilion?
It is in Arsenale. If you know, like there is a freestanding building somewhere in the middle where you finish the first amphilade and you go out, there is a cafe, a toilet, and there is this building, the two-story one, and we are on the first floor, on the top floor basically, yeah.
Hello. I just had a question, whether the Russian army targeted any of the cultural institutions and the museums.
Yes.
They have.
They have.
And they have been destroyed, or?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I mean, in the first days, a very small museum, but of a very prominent artist, Maria Primachenko, was destroyed, and we still don't know whether the artworks and which artworks were there, because they say that the locals tried to save some of them by taking them home. But there is no account of those, and yeah, actually, as far as I know, Cecilia Alemani, then also included one of the works of Maria Primachenko in her, main exhibition at the Venice Biennale. Well, from private collection, obviously, and a couple of other regional museums were also hit. So yes, and the architectural, monuments too, so a lot. I mean, Mariupol, the city in the south, it's completely destroyed. I mean, we haven't seen, the final, view of it, but it's totally destroyed with all its museums and other facilities.
Were the artworks removed before?
Well, we don't know, because there is now, basically the city is in siege and has been so for the last 4 weeks. So no one knows actually where the artworks are, what's going on with whether the 100,000 people who are still staying there dead, alive, what's their condition. So there is no proper understanding.
Hi, thank you, Maria. That was incredibly moving. It's just incredibly real. Thank you very much for sharing. You said you had a sense of it coming. Do you have a sense of what comes next?
Well, I have to speak, of not of my feelings, but of how we in Ukraine, together with experts and also based on some analysis, see what's going on to happen next. Is that they withdrew the forces from around Kiev, and they're now redislocating them in the east of the country, and they will hit there. So Kharkiv should be hit. Mariupol should be. They want to take Mariupol and Kharkiv, before the great day of the victory, which is on the 9th of May. And I'm not, a war expert to give an assessment of the Ukrainian army. I mean, they're super motivated, but of course, we're lacking arms. We're, in comparison with the Russian army, Ukrainian army, it can only, hit with the spirit. But, in terms of arms, we're still far behind. And if there are not going to be more supplies from the partners, I'm afraid, this kind of resistance can't, be long.
Do you mind if I ask a couple things? Is it I don't know what your personal view is on the United States' position, on European countries' position, the amount of aid they've provided and what they haven't provided, and all the symbolism that's involved in that. But is it uncomfortable for you to go to something like the Venice Biennale, where you're seeing representatives for some of these countries that you may not agree with how they have?
But I mean, I'm seeing these people not just in Venice Biennale.
Of course. But I think in Venice, like you said, the performativity aspect of it is that you somehow embody your country.
Of course, but so far, participants, long-term participants of Venice Biennale, like the Baltic countries, I don't know, Canada, I haven't heard from the US yet, but from American museums like Peggy Guggenheim collection. They are very proactive in their support and in their reaching out. I had a couple of meetings like being in Venice with the commissioners and curators of other pavilions. They want to participate in public debate that we will be organizing also on decolonizing, the history of Ukraine from the Russian influence. And yeah, I also want to announce there will be another Ukrainian presence in Venice, and that was a proposal from the Biennale office and from Cecilia. And it's going to be an open structure. We call it now an emergency pavilion in Giardini, right in front of the American Pavilion, actually. There is a lawn, just on that lawn we will have, another presence for a wider circle of voices of artists and from Ukraine. So I hope you won't miss it if you're there, but it will be impossible to miss. And
Can I ask, I don't know how much you want to talk about your own personal situation, but 2 questions. One, if you hadn't fled with the artwork, what would you have done? Would you still be in Ukraine?
I think so, yes.
You would still be there?
Yes.
And are you sort of itinerant after Venice, or what are your plans after?
No, 26th of April is the last day of my accommodation to Venice, and I really hope it will be possible to go back to Kiev. Because, Western Ukraine, it seems a little bit safer, but then there is no place to accommodate anyone for many more months, I think. And the only way to go back is to go back home.
And with the artists that you regularly work with in the gallery, are most of them still in Ukraine?
Yes, most of them are in Ukraine.
Well, let's see, are there any other questions out there?
Hi, Maria. Thank you so much for this, sharing your story. My heart is literally racing. As an Estonian, I feel like I've never, I've never taken independence for granted, and February 24th also marked Estonian Independence Day, which was, it was, trying to celebrate it, but also just thinking about who we are and what's about to come next, and how we, as the, I hate to use the term Eastern Bloc, which is a construct, but how we move forward. I've been thinking about this sense of preserving artworks, and I've kind of heard some stories about Ukrainian museum workers who've spent nights at the museum, have taken artworks home to preserve them, have stayed in Kiev to be with them, and yourself as one of them, fleeing the country on day one to make sure that the artwork makes it to the exhibition. I was just curious if you've kind of heard more stories about that, and if you have, Yeah,
well, there is a huge, how to say, a community of volunteers who are driving around Ukraine, bringing the humanitarian aid from the west of the country to the regions that are in most danger, to Kharkiv, to Kiev, to the south of the country. And on their way back, they're taking the artworks from the institutions, from the artists. Of course, not from the national museums, not from such institutions, but from smaller places. Like our gallery was completely evacuated with the help of such a volunteer. And he's also involved in the art scene, and he's very careful in what he's doing, but he's also, a more kind of a humanitarian volunteer, so he knows the ways how to do it in the most safest way, because there are no guarantees, we risked, of course, doing this, but anything could have happened on the way. So by taking this risk, you understand that, it's not that you have a convoy, protecting your artworks, and they can be easily destroyed on the way, as well as they can be destroyed staying there. Also, Pavlo Makov's work from Kharkiv was evacuated 3 weeks later after he left by his son, who just, he was already staying in the west of Ukraine, but then he decided, that there was a little bit quieter and it's possible to go back, and he went 1,000 kilometers back, took the artworks that he could, and went back to the east of Ukraine.
So I assume he will not be coming to Venice, or will he attempt to make it?
The son of Pavel Makov?
No,
Pablo is in Venice already. Yes.
Oh, he is there.
Yes,
okay.
yes. I shouldn't have forgotten. So there is now like a national program for evacuation, and mostly, the bigger museums, they have their storages underground. So what they did is that they put everything underground, and they hope that it will not reach it. Well, occupation, of course, might influence that, but at least I hope that it's not going to be destroyed completely.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for your talk. Along the same line as the previous question, I'm wondering, has there been any government initiated offers to help? You have like equivalents of the Monuments Men in the Netherlands. You have a unit with like Scotland Yard. I'm wondering if it's not just up to private institutions, if like actual governments are stepping in to help and offering to help protect and preserve the cultural heritage.
Well, the governments, I don't know, but I'm not, the person from the government. I believe that if there were, they would reach out towards, our governments, the Ministry of Culture. But, we were receiving a lot of, proposals from museums in Europe, like from Warsaw Museum of Contemporary Art, from Estonian museums, from Romanian museums, from Moderna Museet even in Sweden, saying that we can organize transport from the border with Ukraine and also organize conservation of it or storage for any possible time. But as for governments, I don't know really. But I believe so, because when I was driving to Venice, I got a couple of calls from the ministries of foreign countries, from Italy, from Lithuania, like who were actually calling me like as if I was their daughter, Dear Maria, how are you, my dear? Like, yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you. It's so great of you to spend this time talking to us. There were two questions I had. One's brief and practical, the other less practical. Is the work at Venice in editions? Is it for sale? Is the first question. The second question is, you referred to the fact that this war is only possible through the exhaustion with democracy. And I was wondering how you sort of reconcile that with your experiences in, outside of Ukraine now, in the conversations, in the cultural sector, how you see the other, democratic nations are faring. Do you see that exhaustion everywhere, and how can cultural institutions combat that, play a role in that?
Mm-hmm. Well, to answer the first question, originally it was for sale. I mean, we were planning to sell it after the Biennale, but now I'm not sure how we're gonna proceed with that. Perhaps we need, to fundraise money with the sales of that work, and we haven't, come up with a proper, communication about that and solution. As for the second question, it's complex. Of course, everything, all, normal, art conversations seem a little bit out of place for myself, but being here, with you, it feels really warm, and I think, in any sense, in any case, art people, public is the most kind of empathic crowd that you could imagine, and you don't have to explain the basics. Basically, I only meet a lot of support at the moment so far, so it's been more than a month, and I've talked to many, many people, but it's mostly, genuine support and very generous support in every sense, emotional and practical. So, well, yeah, it's hard to speak about, this kind of artistic discourses, but I'm not doing that.
Well, it is interesting what you say about democracy, because I think the narrative here is that we, the United States and other countries, take democracy for granted.
For granted. That's
and we see in Ukraine people fighting for freedom, for the kinds of freedoms
absolutely.
that we take for granted. So we see the opposite of the exhaustion of democracy. We see a very energized.
A couple of times I was asked this question that really worries me. Why haven't you thought of surrendering? Capitulation might be, a good way out. And then we'll sit together, us democratic people, and decide what we can do with this tyrant Putin. And of course, this is. Beyond any comprehension for any Ukrainian. You can't tell any Ukrainian things like that. And this is perhaps this example of exhaustion, because for us, democracy is a performance, everyday performance. It has always been so. We had to fight for it all the 30 years of Ukrainian independence, and not just with Russia, but also within the country, with with corruption, with the politicians that we didn't want. And, Ukrainians never took it for granted, and that's why they're ready to die now. We're ready to die now for it.
I mean, it's interesting when you talk about the exhaustion of democracy. I mean, right before the 2016 election, there was an essay. I think Andrew Sullivan's been canceled, but let's put that aside. But there was an essay by Andrew Sullivan in New York Magazine that basically said that Donald Trump is sort of the logical conclusion of democracy. That rather than exhaustion is kind of the apotheosis of democracy.
That's what Putin would say, I think.
That there is like when democracy, the ultimate result is populism, and then you get authoritarianism, and I think that the crazy thing about what's happening in Ukraine is like it's made us, I think, this is what some people are saying, like maybe we can put the polarization aside, and all of us agree, all the politicians who aren't participating in orgies and doing key bumps can agree that democracy is a good thing, and at least we have something to agree on in this country. And, people sort of politically seeing the bright side of, well, at least we have this. Maybe we can reach across the aisle. I mean, there's a lot of strange talk going on, but yeah. Anyhow, on that note, do we have any other questions?
I can show you a couple of slides to entertain you. This is the first Ukrainian pavilion in 2009, a military tent. I think it's very symbolic. This is the after Euromaidan pavilion, which was produced by Pinchuk Center. It's very similar to a military tent, but it's a glass house, built on the fundamenta between Jardinia and Arsenal, and it's called Hope. And the next one was Mria, Dream. And ours is Exhaustion. There is a certain, continuity, I think, between those presentations. And the last one, yes, don't forget, you can support Ukrainian.
The most important slide.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria and Sarah. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.